It's been 7 long years since an Australian leader set foot here in mainland China, and unsurprisingly, Anthony Albanese was keen to set off on the right foot with a focus on the positives. After arriving here in Shanghai last night, he went straight to a banquet hosted by Premier Qiang to mark the opening of a huge trade expo that's taking place in this commercial capital. Hundreds of Australian businesses are at the expo. The Prime Minister will meet some of them today and address a business lunch. Those firms are understandably happy to see the trade relationship improving, and some, no doubt, are hoping for a return to the good old days where there was easy access to this enormous market. But the Australian government knows there will be no back to the future. This relationship has seen its trust shaken by all that's gone on over recent years, and there remains a long list of intractable issues where deep differences remain, from human rights to the ongoing detention of Australian writer Young Heng Jun, and the big one, China's ambition to seize control of Taiwan. I'm going to hand the program over to Patricia Karvelas back in Canberra. First, I want to bring in Katharine Murphy, who's also covering this visit by the Prime Minister here in China. A very warm Shanghai welcome to you.
Lovely Shanghai sunrise, David.
You say it is. It's beautiful. I feel like we should have brought an insider's couch here so we can have this chat. But look, thank you. Look, first, let's start with why we are here. What's taken us from those trade tensions and the diplomatic deep freeze to this official visit?
Yeah, well, I think this is the capstone of a sort of a de-escalation in tensions in the relationship that's played out over the last 12 or 18 months. I think all our viewers at home know the story. There was an escalation of tensions between Canberra and Beijing, started with the exclusion of Huawei from the 5G network, really blew when Scott Morrison had called publicly for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. There was very aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy on the part of China. There's an absolute full-tilt trade war. And there was also very silly language in Canberra, quite frankly, with Scott Morrison and others accusing their Labor counterparts of being Manchurian candidates. So the election happens last year, a new government's in power. That enables China to de-escalate without losing face, which I think has been a critical dynamic here.
It's an opportunity for them to have a circuit breaker.
Well and truly, and start to sort of put the relationship on a new footing. We've seen that play out in increments over the last 12 months. And now we've got the symbolism, David, of the Chinese leadership inviting the Australian Prime Minister to the seat of Chinese power in Beijing.
Well, I just want to explore why China is keen to re-establish some normalisation in the relationship. I mean, obviously Xi Jinping, as he does with other foreign leaders visiting town, will use this to show the Chinese people that here is Australia coming back to the table and showing respect for him and his leadership. Yep. But he's also been under some pressure too to normalise things.
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on in China at the moment. I think we're at a really interesting transition point in China because the country is off its massive prosperity boom. That's that started to level out.
Still growing, but not as fast.
Growing, not as exponentially fast. Basically, COVID has been very difficult for this government to manage. It's hit the economy. There's a very high youth unemployment rate in the city we're in at the moment, David, the beautiful city we're in. We've seen reports over the last week or so of youth protests.
Well, Peter Hartcher, who's on the couch today, has written about that this weekend, a Halloween march or parade that had a little protest element to it.
Yes. Well, young people were making their views known, and from a brief walk along the Bund last night in Shanghai, I can see the city has a very vibrant youth culture.
Yeah, some of them sort of dressed up in surveillance camera costumes. Yes, kind of making a bit of a point there, a bit of a subtle point.
Do you think?
Yeah, so all of this is putting some pressure on Xi Jinping, obviously, so he needs to normalise things as well. And certainly we do see on the trade relationship front improvement. We're expecting the remaining obstacles, which I think is lobster and beef. Maybe we'll see some news on that over the coming few days while the Prime Minister's here. Yeah. Anthony Albanese has really set on a formula when it comes to China. He talks about cooperating where we can, disagreeing where we must. We've heard it a lot, we'll hear it a lot over the next few days, no doubt. It sounds sensible, but it's not necessarily a simple path to follow, is it?
It's not at all simple. There's nothing in this relationship that's simple. Basically, we've sort of been, as we've said, David, in this de-escalation phase. I think the test, really, of whether we've got a genuine rapprochement here or if we're on a new footing is what happens when there is a substantial public disagreement between the two countries, which we sort of haven't really been at that point yet. So I think that that'll be the test about whether or not we're genuinely in new territory or whether this has been a blip.
Yeah, and one of those will surely come along, as they always do. Now, finally, for Anthony Albanese, his comments seem to suggest that the real achievement is actually just being here, having that engagement that we've talked about. But beyond that, do you think he needs to come away with something tangible from these few days?
Well, we'd like to come away with 58 stories, David, wouldn't we? But I think what the Prime Minister wants from this visit, and I think he's been clear about this, and I think Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has also been clear about it. I think their objectives is to have a dialogue with the Chinese leadership that prevents a miscalculation or a misunderstanding that could be catastrophic for Australia and the world. I think Anthony Albanese is one of those Prime Ministers who genuinely wants a rapport with his colleagues. Now, I think getting a rapport with the Chinese leadership is obviously ridiculously ambitious, but he wants a point of contact and he wants a personal connection. And I think it's really interesting, actually, that he and Biden, I think, have been quite overt as that being their objective.
They do seem to be on the same page, and this is all leading towards Biden and Xi meeting at the APEC summit in a couple of weeks in San Francisco as well. Today, all about the good stuff, the trade opportunities, the deals that can be done, the money that can be made. Tomorrow is when the Prime Minister will be in Beijing meeting with President Xi, and that's where some of these difficult issues will no doubt come up. Katharine Murphy, great to talk to you here in Shanghai. It's been wonderful. We'll see you in Beijing. All right, we're going to hand back now to Patricia Karvelas for the rest of the week of political analysis back in the studio.
Thanks, David. My guest this morning is the Treasurer Jim Chalmers. First, let's check what's making news. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the foreign ministers of Jordan and Egypt, as well as Lebanon's Prime Minister in Amman overnight, as the US continued to call for a humanitarian pause in hostilities in Gaza. The Financial Times reports that Jordan's foreign minister urged the US to work with countries in the region to help, quote, stop the madness, while Egypt called for an immediate ceasefire. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has so far rejected those calls, saying a ceasefire requires the immediate release of the 242 hostages still being held by Hamas. Meanwhile, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak has told the Nine Papers that the Albanese government should feel free to express any reservations about Israel's war with Hamas, arguing that his nation needs honest friends rather than mindless barrackers. Barak said he believed his political rival Benjamin Netanyahu was on borrowed time as Prime Minister and would eventually be forced from office for the catastrophic intelligence failure that led to Hamas's massacre of Israelis. For further analysis of the Prime Minister's China trip, I want to bring in my panel now, and I'm joined by Peter Hartcher, Lenore Taylor and Jacob Greber. Welcome to all of you in this joint venture we're on today. I want to start with you, Peter, and we heard the analysis at the top there from of course, David and Katharine. What does the Prime Minister need to achieve on this trip?
I think he's going to achieve at the moment he shakes hands with Xi Jinping. This is essentially a victory lap that Albanese is taking, not on his own behalf, on Australia's behalf, because it does represent an unmitigated triumph for Australia, and it represents a unilateral surrender by Xi Jinping. This has been a remarkable episode in a middle power standing up to China, and it's become a role model around the world. This is one of the reasons that Xi Jinping was keen to end this repression, coercion of Australia, because it was demonstrably failing and encouraging other countries to do the same. Albanese says the point of this visit isn't any announcement or deal that I sign here, it's the fact that I'm here. And I think that's pretty much right. OK.
Now, the Prime Minister's task is also to end the economic coercion. And I think that's been quite an important part, obviously, of the government's work. This is an economic and business project as well. And Simon Birmingham, who's the shadow foreign minister, had some interesting points to make. Here he is.
We shouldn't be showing enormous gratitude for the removal of trade sanctions that should never have been imposed in the first place. We shouldn't be thankful that the economic coercion is coming to an end. We obviously should expect that it ends and that it ends faster.
Lenore, we shouldn't be grateful. Have we been showing that we're grateful?
I really don't see it that way. I mean, I think this is a sort of rapprochement based on realism. As Murph was saying earlier, from China's point of view, they haven't changed their long-term strategic or economic goals, and neither have we changed our strategic allegiances, but it suits both sides for lots of reasons to get the trade relationship flowing again, to get the economic relationship flowing again, and to be talking again. And that's what this visit is going to achieve. I don't think it's really about gratitude, it's about being really pragmatic.
Jacob, it's an interesting critique, though, from the opposition. They've been welcoming the trip, but just talk to me about the way that they've managed the politics around this, given the reason we're in the deep freeze was partly because of the language.
Yeah, I think we've learnt two things. One, China is economically much more vulnerable than we thought. They're really struggling. Xi Jinping, his approach has alienated allies all over the world, trade partners all over the world. He's killed the innovation engine in the middle of the Chinese economy. There are lots of signs of that. So he's coming from a position of weakness on this. That's the first lesson, I think. And the second lesson, you can see the opposition's frustration here. Australia was made a target of Chinese coercion, economic coercion. We took that to the World Trade Organization, and at the last minute we've kind of withdrawn our complaint. That means China can maintain the fiction that it's never been found, in breach of trade rules,
but that's
and that's a problem.
From our part, right? We think that it's going to be resolved in a few months anyway.
Yeah, you could do it without that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, the risk here, and what the opposition's pointing out to the government is, if you put economic concerns over security concerns, you might get a win now. The heat comes out now, but the long-term lesson to China is that's where we'll put our priority.
But a trade dispute could take a decade, to resolve, or many, many years.
It's a very lengthy process through the WTO for sure. Look, the idea of stabilising the relationship, the language, the word we use, the government uses in this relationship, I mean, it's never going to go back, as David Speers said at the top, to those days. Here's Kevin Rudd, who's now, of course, our ambassador to the United States, a China expert and also former Prime Minister.
China itself, through its own leadership, says it is not a status quo power. It does seek to retake Taiwan at some point in the future. It leaves open the possibility of doing so with military force.
Not a status quo situation, is it?
No, China is a revisionist power. And one of the things we should learn both from Vladimir Putin in Russia with Ukraine, but also from Xi Jinping in China, is that when these so-called strongman dictators are coming at you, they let you know. Putin was signalling what he was going to do to Ukraine for years. Nobody took him very seriously. Xi Jinping, from the moment he became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, 2012, even before formally taking the job of president, he gave speeches where he said, I will put China in the position to take the initiative and assert dominance. And he didn't say dominance of the South China Sea. He didn't say dominance of Asia. He's talking global dominance, and that's where he's working towards, and that is undimmed. So the government is wise to use the word stable rather than reset or new beginning or return to normal, because that's impossible. And even stabilisation is ambitious, because it's like trying to stabilise when you're sitting on top of a live volcano. You can sit there for a while and nothing will happen, but eventually it's going to blow.
Yeah, but you really hope that it doesn't blow very often, right?
and
labour that
not to torture the volcano metaphor, but should something happen, having ties, having a dialogue and having more economic ties is going to put you in a slightly better position to deal with it than if that's not the case.
Yes, and look, this has done Australia a huge favour, because it's woken us up. China, Xi Jinping revealed his true face. When the coercion started, Australia was relying on China for a touch under 40% of all exports, which is just not prudent. And now it's a touch under 30%. So that's improved our overall standing and our overall diversification.
Now, the other prickly part of this trip is the detained Australian writer Yang Hangzhang. The Prime Minister said before he left, he said in Darwin he would be raising it. Is there any hope that some resolution will be found?
I don't know, is my honest answer on that. You're kind of peering through the murky glass.
No, but there was success with Cheng Lei, but that's a different...
It's a different case. Like, each case is different. So, I don't know. Yeah.
What do you think, Lenore, in terms of managing raising those more difficult issues at the same time as, you know, red carpets and fancy dinners.
I think the Prime Minister's been clear, as he should be, that he will and he needs to be clear about that while he's in China, in order to maintain the stance he's taking that, you know, this is a stabilisation. It's not us giving up any of our values.
Yeah. Time to talk to the Treasurer now, Jim Chalmers. But first, here's the Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham calling for an immediate end to China's trade sanctions.
We continue to have the concerns about China's weaponisation of trade, economic coercion and attempts of Australia and the punishment they have applied against us, all of which we have to condemn in the strongest possible terms and expect to cease now, forthwith, not in 5 months' time, not in other ways. Our wine industry shouldn't have to wait. Our live seafood exporters shouldn't have to wait. Our meat industry shouldn't have to wait. All of those sectors should be demanding that China cease the sanctions, cease the weaponisation of trade against us.
Treasurer, welcome to Insiders. I'm having some trouble hearing you, Treasurer. Hopefully we'll be able to resolve that. The Prime Minister is now in China. I understand your time as acting Prime Minister has literally just ended. But let's go to the China visit. What is your benchmark for success from this trip?
Well, Patricia, a bit like yourself today, I sub in for short but enthusiastic bursts off the bench. And that's what we've seen the last day or so. Look, this is a really important visit by Prime Minister Albanese. It's the first official visit by a Prime Minister into China since 2016, and I think it recognises that a stable relationship is in the interests of both countries. Now, we are clear-eyed about the complexities and the challenges of managing this relationship, but we give ourselves the best chance of prospering together if we engage with one another. And we've already seen some of the fruits of that effort. Something like 95% of the trade restrictions by dollar value have been lifted. That's good for our businesses, our exporters and our workers. And that's why it's so important that this engagement has been happening for some time and why it's so important that this official visit is taking place this week.
But for it to be a real success, do those restrictions on beef and lobster need to be removed by the end of the year?
Oh, we've made no secret of the fact that we'd like to see the trade restrictions lifted, and something like 95% of them by dollar value have been lifted. That's a very good thing. I pay tribute to the PM and Minister Wong and Minister Farrell and others for getting those kinds of outcomes, which are good for our local economy, our local workers and businesses and exporters, as I said. That's been good progress. We want to see the trade restrictions lifted, but that's not the primary purpose of this meeting this week. This week is part of a bigger and broader effort to stabilise a really important economic relationship, and we've seen some of the fruits of that already.
Let's talk about Tuesday's Reserve Bank meeting. You've said that the jump in inflation we saw in those latest figures does not materially change the inflation outlook going forward. So if Michelle Bullock and the Reserve Bank raises interest rates on Tuesday, have they misread the data?
Oh, that's not how I'd characterise it, Patricia. I've said before, and I'm happy to repeat again today, the Reserve Bank has its own job to do. It's an important job. They'll do that independently. And whatever their decision on Tuesday, they'll have opportunities to explain it publicly. I'm focused on my job, which is to get the budget in much better nick, to roll out billions of dollars of cost of living help in a way that takes the edge off inflation rather than add to it, and invest in energy and housing and skills. And what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, whether it's the International Monetary Fund saying that our budget settings are helping rather than hampering the fight against inflation, whether it's Governor Bullock saying that our budget strategy is very helpful and very positive, a good budget strategy for the times, or whether it's the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which said that our policies actually took 0.5 percentage point off inflation in that most recent data. So I'm focused on my job. The Reserve Bank has got its own job to do. They'll do that independently and appropriately, and they'll meet on Tuesday.
Aren't you intervening into their job by talking about the material changes and saying there's no material changes? Are you jawboning the RBA?
Oh, of course not, Patricia, and I'm pleased you asked me about that because I've seen some, frankly, ridiculous commentary about this in recent days. You know, by the bizarre logic of some of that commentary, the Treasurer of Australia is not allowed to comment on the Treasury's forecasts for inflation on the day that the inflation figures come out. I mean, that is plainly and frankly ridiculous.
But if you're concluding that there's no material change, aren't you then saying that you don't think there should be a change in rates? Because if there's no material change, why should there be a change in
Well, I'm
interest
referring
rates?
in a factual way. On the day of the inflation figures, since then, and I'm happy to repeat again today, that the Treasury, as a consequence of those that inflation data that we received not that long ago, hasn't changed its estimation or its expectation of when inflation will return back to the target band. I said that then, but I also said on the day, and I've said since, and I'm happy to say again today, it's entirely appropriate for the Reserve Bank to come to their own conclusions on that independently. No doubt they have been working through the inflation data and weighing that up against the evidence that our economy is slowing and some of this global uncertainty, and they'll make their decision independently. They've got a job to do. I'm focused on my job.
OK, I've got a question on your job. The IMF has also urged governments, particularly the states, to delay or to axe infrastructure spending as a way of taking some heat out of the economy. Do you back that? Do you think that's what should happen?
Well, the IMF, I think, has made an important point, which is that we need to roll out our infrastructure investment in a way that gets us value for money, but also in a more measured and coordinated way. And I think that's a point well made. And this is one of the motivations for the infrastructure review that my colleague Katharine King has been undertaking. We are concerned that when the number of projects went from something like 150 projects to about 800 projects announced by our predecessors, there was a lot of announcement but a bit short on delivery, and because of the pressures in the labour market and the pressures on building costs and other costs, we have seen big blowouts in the program. I think the independent review identified something like $33 billion in blowouts in costs. So of course that is a concern to us.
But do you also think there should be a pulling back of infrastructure, delays, even axing some projects at the state level to take the heat away from inflation? Is that a direct link that you see?
Yeah, yes, I do, Patricia. I do think we're going to need to make some difficult decisions about the infrastructure pipeline, which factors in those $33 billion of blowouts from projects announced by our predecessors, and which factors in our inflation challenge. I do think we need to be upfront about that, and the work that Katharine is doing, engaging with the states, is to work out how we get maximum value for money, how we get the right infrastructure for our people and for their economy without putting additional upward pressure on inflation. That is a key motivation for this infrastructure review that we will make public before long. And so I think in that regard, the comments from the International Monetary Fund are important, they are welcome, and they are consistent with the way that we are coming at this challenge.
We talked about the Reserve Bank on Tuesday. Of course, they have an all-important meeting on Melbourne Cup Day that everyone will be watching. You still actually need to appoint a Deputy Governor of the RBA. Where are you at with that? And has Michelle Bullock, your new Governor, who was the Deputy, been involved in those discussions?
Oh, Michelle Bullock has been deeply involved in our work to appoint a new Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank. I'm hoping to announce the new Deputy Governor before the meeting of the Reserve Bank on the 5th of December. So after the meeting on Tuesday, but before the meeting in December, I hope to announce the new Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank. We have been interviewing a number of candidates from the shortlist, some internal, some external, some from Australia, some from overseas.
Are there any names you can share with us?
Not prepared to share any names today. We've got some more due diligence to do, and I want to make sure that I take it to the Cabinet colleagues in the course of the next month. But we're choosing between internal and external, Australian and overseas. We have been consulting very, very closely with Michelle Bullock because we need to make sure that the Deputy is someone who can work closely with her but also complement some of these other appointments that she will make, the Assistant Governor Economic, the Chief Operating Officer. So you've got
someone in mind?
Oh, well, obviously we're narrowing down a shortlist.
Sounds like it's really short.
It's quite short, Patricia, the short list, but we've got some more due diligence to do. And I want to take it to the Cabinet colleagues, which is appropriate. But I hope to announce the new Deputy Governor before the Reserve Bank meets early in December.
Have you finalised the RBA legislation, and I'm wondering when it will be tabled and whether you will have in that legislation a full execution of all the recommendations?
I'll be introducing the Reserve Bank review legislation in the last week of November. It has come after a long period of consultation with the Reserve Bank, with the opposition and with others, and there's been, I think, a really welcome debate, public debate, about the recommendations of the review that I released early in April. That's been a good thing, and so we've taken into consideration all of that feedback, all of that consultation and collaboration. And what people can expect to see in the RBA review legislation is keeping faith with the recommendations of the review, but there have been a couple of instances where after that consultation and collaboration we think we've got a better way to land the spirit of the review. And one example I'm prepared to share with you, Patricia, is you'll recall in the RBA review there was a conversation about a line ball call about who chairs the new governance board of the Reserve Bank. The line ball call, according to those reviewers, was between the Governor and an external chair. I intend to legislate the Governor chairing that new governance board, at least for the first 5 years until we review it and make sure it's working as we intended. That's been one example, a welcome example of where the consultation has landed a position which recognises the review said it was a line ball call. We'll go with the Governor in the first instance.
Why though? What's the rationale? Why does the Governor need to chair that board?
Well, we think given that there is a big change management program that we're asking the Reserve Bank to do, that it is appropriate, at least initially, for the Governor to chair the three boards, Payments Board, the Monetary Policy Board and the Governance Board. We recognise that the reviewers said it was a line ball call. There were good arguments in both directions. We've done the consultation and we've landed here. My interest here and my objective here is to land this change management program at the Reserve Bank. I'm confident that Governor Bullock will help us do that, and that's why, at least initially,
and was it
she
Michelle
will chair
Bullock
the three
who
boards.
asked for that? Has she been lobbying, or lobbying is too strong a word, but asking to chair that board?
I think lobbying is too strong a word, but we have had really a heap of conversations. I talk with Michelle Bullock, I think, at least weekly. I met with her in person again last week. And the Reserve Bank has a view. The opposition has a view too, and I welcome their input. And there's been a good public debate about it as well. We think this lands the best combination in order to implement this change management program at the Reserve Bank. And this Reserve Bank review legislation, which I'll introduce at the end of November, this comes really as part of a flurry of legislative activity in our portfolio, legislating the Reserve Bank review, legislating the objective of super, a fairer approach to superannuation tax concessions, the first tranche of the PRRT legislation, the first tranche of the response to what happened at PwC to be legislated. The pace of legislative activity in the Treasury portfolio is actually quickening rather than slowing as we approach Christmas. And we've also obviously got the mid-year budget update. So a lot of work going on, but this Reserve Bank review implementation is a big priority for the government.
Okay, Treasurer, I just want to take you to a very significant speech you delivered this week where you said we look like we might not be on track to meet our net zero ambitions and that we need more intervention and more investment from industry. You flagged more government interventions. What does that intervention look like? And might you look at altering the safeguards mechanism?
Well, what I tried to do during the week, Patricia, is to say that we've got this ambitious but achievable targets when it comes to the energy transformation, and we've got vast industrial and economic and employment opportunities which flow from our goals to be a renewable energy superpower. And we are making good progress across both of those fronts. But from my perspective as Treasurer, what I tried to say is that what we need to do is not just to attract and commit more private and more public capital, but we need to be able to absorb and deploy that investment in the most efficient and effective way. And so some of the things that we need to consider as we work towards the next budget is to make sure we get the skills base, the technological base, the relationship with the states right as well. And so I identified in that speech, in conjunction with the relevant ministers, the big opportunities we've got in areas like critical minerals, green steel, hydrogen, battery manufacturing.
But is it about picking winners ultimately? I mean, is that the way that it works if a government chooses what to invest in rather than having a mechanism that makes those decisions?
Well, the mechanism is to apply what we would consider to be a new set of net zero industry policy tests around supply chains and national security and value for money and what's best able to deliver our emissions reductions goals. And when you do that, some of these comparative advantages that Australia has become quite obvious, and I've just rattled through them. Now, the incentives and the way that we work with the private sector, who will be the primary driver, the way that we work with the states, that might be different for each of those 4 technologies that I've identified. But what I tried to do in that speech is to say that this will be a focus between now and the May budget. Attracting and committing capital is part of it. Making sure we can deploy it is part of that as well. The energy transformation is absolutely central to our goals in this defining decade. We've got to get it right. We've made good progress and we've got a bit more to do.
Treasurer, thanks for joining Insiders.
Thanks, Patricia.
Now, we're going to get with our panel to the Gaza-Israel crisis, but just on that interview with the Treasurer Jim Chalmers on a lot of those issues, including Tuesday's potential rate hike, starting with you, Peter. Some interesting points in that interview, actually, in terms of the Reserve Bank. The Deputy Governor looks on the cusp of being appointed, and also that legislation to shake it up. But how do you think the Treasurer handled those questions around the jawboning? Because he has been accused of jawboning the RBA.
I think he defended himself about as well as he could, and making the point that a Treasurer is allowed to talk about the economy isn't a bad point. I thought that the point about allowing the Governor to chair the governance board in the bank, that's important, and it shores up the authority of the Governor, because to do otherwise would have been a pretty serious undercutting of the Governor's power, prestige and position.
And clearly the Governor was making it quite clear that...
I would imagine so. But I thought it was your questions and the Treasurer's answers about the green energy transition that were really also quite telling. He's really just given us a big heads up that the next budget is going to contain a raft of measures on industry policy. This is a fundamental, break in Australian economic policy. He is talking about picking winners. It's exactly what that is, Patricia. It's the antithesis of the last 40 years. So that was important. And the 4 technologies that he mentioned: hydrogen, critical minerals, battery manufacture, and green steel, can all expect measures in the forthcoming budget to promote more investment.
Yeah. Lenore, I mean, he did certainly put it in the budget framework. Clearly, they're working on it being, well, one of the significant centrepieces of the budget.
Yeah, so we had thought that perhaps it might come out before the end of the year in MAEFO. It's clearly now in next May's budget. You know, given that we just spent a decade faffing around on whether climate change was real or not, another few months probably is neither here nor there. He's right to say that the government's targets are difficult to meet, and difficult to meet because we've started so late in the race. Yes, it's picking winners, but I mean, he seemed to be saying there might be different incentive mechanisms within each of those 4 designated areas. So within each... And that sort of makes sense to me, because there's, what you need in each part is so different. So, yeah, I think next year's budget will be extremely consequential in the whole energy transformation. He seems very targeted on that. I mean, there's the broader emissions target as well, where the government is also a bit behind the 8 ball. I mean, we don't have fuel efficiency standards yet, for example, and transport is 1/3 of our emissions, and we're way behind the 8 ball on that as well. So they're playing catch up on a lot of fronts.
Yeah, Jacob, after the referendum, where the government, I think, really was focused on another issue, at least publicly. They kept telling us they're working on all these other things. I think that interview was very much the Treasurer telling us we're working on these raft of policies in the economic space. That's the central message they're trying to get out.
I thought the most significant thing from what he said this morning was pointing out the infrastructure spend.
You've all picked 3 different points, 3 new stories.
Hear me out on this. He knows there's a very likely chance of a rate hike on Tuesday. he's going to cop a lot of political pressure for that. He's starting to point at the states, all their infrastructure spend, as the IMF pointed out. The problem for him and the government, and it goes to this issue of picking winners and pumping more money into that sector of the economy to accelerate the transition, that will be an inflationary force. Where will the trimming happen on infrastructure? Victoria is the biggest debt binger of all the states. It's building a rail loop. Is that the project? Or is it something in New South Wales, which is also doing a lot of building? Or is it stuff the federal government can control? We've got Inland Rail, we've got Snowy, and we've got 10,000 kilometres of transmission line to build.
Well, it won't be the last one because that'll stuff up.
Right. So he's.
Priorities.
I think he's made it pretty clear where he's seeing the blame will fall, and that's the problem for the government. This inflation problem's not going away, and we want to do all these things, which are creating all sorts of problems for getting skilled workers, getting materials, getting approvals done, all those things.
I think, Jacob, you were dead right. I thought that was very significant that he, bought into what the IMF is calling for. And when I asked again, he said, yeah, I agree with the IMF. Like he didn't leave any sort of grey, did he? Because he's also aware that after this many rate hikes, that the opposition's gunning for the government and saying, well, they're all happening under your watch, the government needs to do more heavy lifting.
Yeah, and I think cost of living is obviously the government's weak point. I mean, I haven't seen any prescriptions from the opposition, but at this stage of the cycle, nor would you expect to. And the government has got a task to do to remind people of what measures they've done and to try to sort of explain that this is going to take time to bring inflation under control and to get things back to some sort of semblance of people not staying up at night worrying about how they're going to pay their mortgage.
It's a big reset, though, isn't it, Peter? I mean, on all of these fronts, Tuesday looms as a very difficult day for the government. I think the Prime Minister comes back to Australia around then and, he's walking into another rate rise. The domestic politics around this are very hard.
Yes, they are. The government, the calendar helped the government shift attention away from its failure with the voice referendum and helped with trips to Washington and now Beijing to change the subject entirely, which has been pretty effective. But then they're going to have to get plunged back into an uncomfortable topic if indeed the Reserve Bank does put up rates, and government will be only too happy for the Melbourne Cup to get all the coverage.
The other big issue that has emerged is, the Prime Minister's travelled a lot. Prime Ministers do that, but certainly the opposition has not given him a free ride, so to speak, on that, Lenore, have they? They're really gunning for him and the idea of how much time he spent out of the country.
I just feel like this is a bit of a silly argument, really. I mean, the idea that you can separate out domestic cost of living issues and what the Prime Minister's doing overseas. Obviously, the trading relationship with China feeds directly into living standards in Australia. Obviously, at a time like this in international affairs, it is good for the Prime Minister to have the ear of the President. So, I mean, it's an easy line for the opposition to make. But if you think about it for 2 seconds, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, it was one that was used against Kevin Rudd, of course, when Kevin 07.
Well, and Anthony Albanese is actually not travelling more than previous Prime Ministers either.
That's interesting by comparison, but obviously the timing of some of these trips back to back.
I mean, like the US trip. I personally think that was probably a nice to have, not a needed trip.
I've got to challenge you on that.
It was a make-up for the Quad. Let's face it.
But
it was a make-up for.
Given they are our most important relationship.
And you're going to say state visit, no thanks? Really?
Well, you've got to prioritise these things. Sorry, Peter.
Patricia, I think this is a silly thing that oppositions say when they've got nothing constructive to say. They started calling him Airbus Albo after he'd made 2 trips. He'd made 2 trips out of the country. This is just a nonsense argument. It's midterm noise and no one will remember or care by the next election.
It might be a nonsense argument, but if people are really struggling with the cost of living, it can be damaging though, right?
But I think you can pull these things apart. Yes, people are struggling on the cost of living, and yes, the government really needs to remind people what they've done on that and talk about that a lot. But I don't think you necessarily need to link it to the travel.
And I think the next budget is the government is already looking at options for more cost of living measures. But that's for the next budget.
Jacob, I just want to get you actually on that because there is enormous pressure on them and they're feeling the heat very much. How much is the construction at MyEFO very soon and then the budget going to be around that?
Around cost of living?
Yeah.
Well, rhetorically, probably a lot.
Yeah, but in substance?
In terms of actual relief that they can bring, it's the problem they've had for the last 18 months. You can't put a lot of extra money into people's pockets without making the inflation problem worse. So yeah, you can bring relief to certain points, and that might give you a headline dip in the inflation rate, but you're making room for other spending in that. So they're very limited on that front.
Very difficult decision on Tuesday for Michelle Bullock too as the new governor. I want to change the conversation and talk about the biggest story in the world, and that is, of course, the war in Gaza. And this week, some shifts in language that were delivered by both the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. Let's just start first with the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. Here she is.
All of these challenges do not lessen Israel's obligation to observe international law and the rules of war. Even in war, there are rules. And I again would make this point. The international community will not accept ongoing civilian deaths.
Now, the government hasn't changed its position. It's still defending Israel's right to defend itself, or supporting that position. But has there been a significant shift in the language this week?
Yes, there has. We've heard it from Penny Wong, we've heard it from Anthony Albanese, and it's consistent with a shift worldwide as developed democracies have all changed their rhetoric simply because of the oppressive and distressing weight of suffering going on in Gaza that is relentlessly being broadcast and that undercuts support for Israel. It puts pressure on our leaders and the leaders of other democracies to start to distance themselves from the Israeli treatment of civilians. And that's what this is really about. You can't have, it's one thing to believe Hamas's claims about fatalities from Israeli bombings. No one should believe Hamas. They're just baby murderers. Why would you treat their statistics seriously? But when you have charities and humanitarian organisations and UN agencies, Save the Children, saying 400 children killed or injured every day, the real tell here was when the US President Joe Biden had to stand up and say, we need Israel to institute a humanitarian pause.
Yeah, that was a significant moment this week, Jacob.
Yeah.
Now, a pause is not a ceasefire, to be very clear, but Blinken has been talking, but he doesn't seem to Netanyahu. He doesn't seem to be getting anywhere, though.
I think this is, and Peter's alluding to it, this is the problem with all of these leaders in the West being seen to be giving Netanyahu a kind of blank cheque. No one has a veto on what that guy does, and the danger is it goes too far, and we're seeing signs that it is going too far. And I don't think the Albanese government need feel, that be a problem. Now, there's domestic political concerns here, but I think Albanese's been consistent over many years on Israel as a supporter of Israel. Think back to that Max Brenner, remember the divestment campaign? He went down and, took on the Marrickville hipsters, told them to stop doing it, So I don't think they've got to feel somehow they've got to make extra ground here. But it's this big problem of sort of accepting what Netanyahu does.
Let's hear the Prime Minister talking about this issue.
It is critical as well that this war does not expand into other theatres. The consequences of that for Israel's security are dire, and Israel needs to recognise that in the way that it conducts itself, because the images that have been seen of the refugee camp, quite rightly, will cause enormous concern around the world.
Lenore, that's the strongest language we've heard from the Prime Minister. What message is he trying to send? He's trying to walk a very narrow path.
They do have to walk a narrow path here, but I think anyone looking at the evidence from Gaza, the pictures from Gaza, the stories from Gaza, any government would feel the need to react to that humanitarian horror. And our government has in calling for this pause. I think it was also interesting, a piece that Penny Wong wrote for us over the weekend, where she started to talk about what might happen, like how this might actually be one day somehow resolved. And the ingredients that she said would be necessary were the dismantling of Hamas, a reformed Palestinian Authority that disavowed violence, and Israel completely stopping establishing settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now that is, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu's signature policy. That is what he's about. So the government is sort of now not just saying two-state solution, but what could that look like? What would have to happen for that to be a reality? And I think that's interesting as well.
There's also the domestic political pressures. Now, this is a war, I want to make it quite clear that loss of life is all that matters. But obviously politicians are very, very aware of the community sentiment going on. And from the left, in some of those seats that are being targeted by Greens, the government is overwhelmingly getting the feedback that it needs to take a stronger line, Peter. How much would that be affecting the way that they're thinking about this?
A lot. It's got broad community support to keep in mind, but it's also got the specific seats. And this is a pressure cooker. The longer this goes on, the more pressure builds up within Albanese's own government. And the MPs that he's got representing Muslim populations in Western Sydney, the pressure is building. And you've showcased some of the ministers who've really needed to speak out on this, and we would see more of that. Can I just latch on to something Albanese said that's really core here? He talks about the risk of broadening the war.
Yes.
What he's getting at, I think, is that the more careless or reckless Netanyahu appears to be with the treatment of civilians in Gaza, the more he hands a pretext to Iran to escalate. Now, all of this is in Iran's hands. Iran is the big player here. It has power over Hamas, Hezbollah, militias in Syria, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, plus its own military. And all of those have been activated to some degree or another. And it's open to Iran to escalate in a way that would bring potentially bring the existence of Israel into question. That is the really big risk. And what Albanese is saying is, Netanyahu, stop feeding the Iranians the pretext that they might be.
Because the government is gravely worried about this becoming a regional war now.
And if it does, the US would be drawn in directly to defend Israel. Imagine what that does. And imagine if I'm Xi Jinping, how I look at this situation, if I've got the US busy in Israel, busy with Ukraine, Indo-Pacific's looking pretty tempting.
The panel will be back in a moment for final observations, but time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with satirist and player in the war on 2023, the one and only Mark Humphries, and a very warm welcome. And you are about to embark on a tour.
A national tour, that's right. It's an annual comedy gala, and I do assure viewers that funny things did happen this year, although it doesn't seem to be the case.
No.
Looking at the news this week.
The war over in the Middle East intensified as the ground offensive got underway in Gaza. Mark Knight has done the former Prime Ministers here. They all apparently signed a letter denouncing Hamas and calling on less death.
Yes, it's like the Avengers, but for political nerds, isn't
it? Yeah, really is. Matt Golding has got Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong sitting on the fence somewhat here.
Yes, Israel's right to defend itself.
But show restraint.
Yeah. This is the two-statement non-solution.
Yeah,
well, that's what happens when you're a middle power. You're sort of just somewhere in the middle.
Say middle things.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Very middling.
Megan Herbert has got human rights, which is water, shelter and food, and human wrongs, which is bombing people's homes and killing people.
Megan Herbert's having just such an amazing year. She's just gone from strength to strength with her work this year, and just another simple image that she's gone for here.
Yeah. Kathy Wilcox worried about balance. You worried about balance?
Well, obviously, I'm in the ABC. I have to be worried about balance.
She's got we're meticulous about balance at the council chambers with the Dove of Peace and the bombs. So peaceful aggressiveness. Brett Lethbridge did this lovely cartoon on Anthony Albanese's upcoming visit. Last week he visited the great and powerful friend in the United States, and this week it's the powerful friend. We're not sure whether he's a friend yet.
Well, I mean, it's been a while since we've been. It was 7 years since.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
He needs to change his shirt from AUKUS to awkward, I think, because it's yet to see what it's going to be like.
Very frosty.
Yeah, very frosty. Lovely Andrew Dyson. Is that a Biden in your pocket, or are you just glad to see me?
I feel like he had his dessert first with the US trip.
No, he did.
Now he's got to have the veggies in China.
They say that there's no certainties in life but death and taxes, but I'd like to add, and Tony Abbott's crappy views.
Oh, crappy and, for balance, inspired.
He gave an address to the Alliance for Responsible Citizens. Sounds pretty innocuous, doesn't it?
Sure.
Yeah. Lovely Fiona Katauskas. Back by unpopular demand, Tony Abbott live in London with classics like Climate Change is Crap.
Science? What science?
And I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I'm shamelessly going to talk about it anyway.
Tony who?
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary because Tony Abbott obviously has been a volunteer firefighter for over 20 years, which was a fantastic thing. He's, you know, he's a Prime Minister who actually does hold a hose.
Yeah.
And yet bizarrely has for so long promoted, you know, ideas which make that situation worse.
Yeah. Speaking of people talking rubbish and people talking great things.
Thank you.
We've got John Howard in the Old People's Home, and he also gave a speech to the Alliance for Responsible Citizenry too. He said that if you come to another person's country, you should adopt their culture and ways, which I'm sure our First Nations people were very interested to hear.
Oh, yeah, indeed, absolutely. So I think what he meant was tracksuits for everybody. That's it.
I will decide which concepts of multiculturalism I'll have trouble with and the circumstances in which they come. Howard, trouble with multiculturalism is the headline. And the staff here are having a little conversation.
I've always had trouble with the concept of John Howard.
Yeah. And not had trouble with it. For balance. This year at the 39th Stanley Awards, the Australian Cartoonists Association had an inaugural climate cartoon competition set up by the Climate Council as a bit of an answer to the fossil fuel boycott of the Walkley. Megan Herbert won, and she won for this cartoon. What harm could one more do, as the domino here is just being toppled over.
From coal mine approval going through to sea level rise, biodiversity loss, extreme weather, food shortages, total system collapse, and then life as we know it.
House is squashed. Kathy Wilcox won the People's Choice climate cartoon with What's the Panic? It's all the way up the front end of the boat as the business as usual boat is starting to burn. And she also won Political Cartoonist of the Year. Big year for Kathy. And the Cartoonist of the Year at the Stanleys was the one and only David Rowe.
The great David Rowe. Congratulations to all.
It's been a great pleasure unpicking some pretty tough events this week, and also for balance, it's not been a pleasure at all. I wish you'd go away.
It's been an absolute show.
Back to the panel now with final observations. Jacob.
We talked a lot about the RBA and the governance arrangements around that. The Treasurer is also seeking to rework the Productivity Commission, which is the nation's think tank, economic think tank. He wants to sign a statement of, I think the language is expectations. Call me a bit old-fashioned, but that's sounding rather Orwellian, so it'd be good to see what that actually means in reality.
Climate change is certainly on it.
There was a conference this week at Bletchley Park in the UK looking at the incredibly rapidly emerging technologies around AI. Governments did at least kind of consider that, yes, it might need some sort of regulation or oversight. There were a few examples at home this week about how not to use AI. One in particular stood out for me, which were the academics who had to apologise to a Senate committee because they used AI to write their submission and falsely accused the Big Four accounting firms of a whole lot of scandals that they hadn't been involved in at all and in fact didn't exist.
Oh dear. Peter.
Picking up on the talking pictures theme about multiculturalism, you know, there's a lot going on, a lot of stress. Australia can't control the outcome of China. It can't control the outcome in Israel and Gaza. But we've got a lot of Chinese Australian citizens. We've got a lot of people who care a lot about Israel. A lot of people care a lot about Palestinians. All we can control is our own country, and we have to remember, I think, mutual respect is the way we hold our social cohesion and prevent these problems becoming our problems.
Absolutely. Very well put. Thank you. You've been a great panel. And actually, Lenore, on your artificial intelligence theme, finally this week, President Joe Biden signed an executive order designed to make AI safer, a move that sparked the artistic intelligence of our very own Hugh Parkinson. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Let me tell you why you're here. Have you ever had a dream that you were so sure was real? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
I don't know how I would have done it.
Do you want to know what it is? AI.
Artificial intelligence.
It is everywhere. Even now, in this very room.
Wow. AI is all around us. It's mind-blowing.
You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television.
But you know what I watched? Mission Impossible. Whoa, did you see that?
You have to see it for yourself.
Whoa. My God, what is this? Science fiction. Deep fakes.
We can load anything we need.
It must be governed. That way you can tell whether it's real or it's not.
What is real? How do you define real?
Here, take a cookie.
I came down because I heard there was chocolate chip ice cream.
Sorry, kid.
There is no spoon.
God almighty. Everyone has a right to know when audio or video is generated or altered by AI.
It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. Do you know what I'm talking about?
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.